Welcome back to Moy and Nathan Go to School on the Adventist Peace Radio podcast. It's great to have you with us. Nathan Brown here, and Moy, welcome again.
Hello everybody. Welcome.
We are talking, going to school, and we've got a bit of catching up to do. It's a while since we've talked about what we've been reading and studying and thinking about and wrestling with as we're studying human rights.
It has been a while.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us, and we'll do a bit of catching up.
Very much a lot of catching up because, there's a few things we need to really catch up on.
I think we're both in catch up mode. There's 3 weeks of this semester that we're trying to catch up on, but we really should be 5 weeks of semester we should be catching up on. And had an assignment due today.
Yes, I do have an assignment due today on the other unit. So that's a bit of fun.
Okay, so dear me. We're going to have to talk fast so that you can get back to working on your assignment.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Let's begin with an acknowledgement of country. We respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of this land. We pay tribute to elders past and present and acknowledge that they have cared for this country over countless generations.
Yes.
And on that topic, I've actually recently, and I think I mentioned this a few months ago, of working on a book project editing a history of Adventist Indigenous mission from the early part of the 20th century. And that book is now available, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's called Remembering Mona Mona, and Mona Mona was an Adventist Aboriginal mission in North Queensland that operated from about 1913 to 1962 and was the only Adventist mission of that kind for Indigenous people that operated in Australia. Fascinating book, pretty heavy duty.
That's quite the undertaking.
It's about 300 pages of some heavy duty history, and reasonably honest about some of the challenges and the being part of the government system for processing, protecting, and I use that word advisedly, regulating the lives of Australia's Indigenous people and the church also, but in the same context, trying to do mission. And to some people with really good intentions, albeit of that time, who really wanted to serve and uplift the Indigenous people who had been so disadvantaged by dispossession and marginalisation and all of those things in the early part of Australia's history. So a fascinating project to be working on. A beautiful book cover. It's actually an original piece of art by one of the descendants from the mission.
That's awesome.
And with the dot painting supplemented by the image of the dove as the Holy Spirit. And so you'll have to look up the book link.
Just for the book cover.
Just to have a look at the book cover. Yeah. And somewhat of a special interest book. But again, alerted me to some of the aspects of the interaction between colonising European Australian history and Indigenous Australian history, and the clash of those two things, and the ongoing disadvantage that has been a part of it. And even one of the interesting things was to, of course, part of working on the project was interacting with some of the people who grew up on the mission who are still alive. Yeah. And there is a group of about 15 elderly Aboriginal people who were interviewed for the book, who grew up or were born on the mission. And some of them are now very old, and some of them are very positive about the grounding that their life on the mission gave them as they grew up to be lifelong members of the Adventist Church, and the difference that made in their lives and their families and their community.
That's awesome.
At the same time as there's also some really strong negative memories.
Yeah, well, there's trauma. Yeah.
So a fascinating thing to look at that balance, and balance probably isn't the right word, but to look at it honestly. And to look at it, that the process of truth-telling is a part of the reconciliation process. And that's important in and of itself, but also to recognise that the missionaries that were operating this were doing it largely with good intentions, even if ignorantly and naively, and at times with less than good intentions. But all of those things kind of thrown into the mix, and fascinating to try and, 300 pages to try and make sense of that to a degree, and a number of different researchers that contributed to that book. And that book was launched yesterday at the time of recording at the Australian Church's session.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, that was kind of fun. It was kind of it took us quite a bit of work to get it there in time, but it was a worthwhile project and one that I learnt a lot from. So
yeah.
check
That's
it out
awesome.
in the show notes, and if you really want to deep dive into one very specific part of Australian Indigenous history with an Adventist flavour, you can jump in and you can buy it as an ebook, or you can get it from a bookstore near you if you're in the right part of the world.
Will it be available elsewhere outside of Australia?
Probably not, because of its very specific nature. Sure. But if you really do have an interest in it, I'm sure you can get in touch in one way or another and be able to get a copy, or can purchase the ebook from anywhere in the world. So
sure. Awesome. Well, congratulations.
Yeah, it's been one of those big projects, and I guess talking about our university studies and how far behind I am, that's one of my excuses.
Well, I have no excuse then. Well, I mean, I have excuses that may not be as good as yours. I am not undertaking a 300-page writing project that's outside of university. So anyhow, so we're back to it then.
Good, clean fun. That's right.
Yeah.
So we've started, and of course in the last episode we didn't talk so much about what we were doing study-wise.
Yeah.
So, Moy, tell us a little bit about what you've been learning so far this semester, or at least an idea or two that's really caught your attention.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this semester, you and I, I'm doing 2 subjects, 2 units, and one of them we are sharing. But the one unit that you and I are both attempting, one of the lectures, I guess, has had me thinking about this whole idea of language. The lecturer talks about dialogue and then the use of language. Like, I've never fully known about the violence, that is in languages, for instance, not just using a certain words violently, but the way in which cultural knowledge and cultural languages have been, to use the word dispossessed, because that's kind of language of human rights, but in particular, the privileging of the English language. And that's probably one of the more recent lecture that I have caught up in. And also this idea of, and even just reading about it, the furthering of the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the area of knowledge and using the English language, for instance. So what made me think about that even more was because, one of the comments he made in the lecture was, when it comes to the use of language to marginalize people, and especially when they talk about the global south, he used the example of, you have these elders and chiefs and people like local native people who have immense amount of knowledge and intelligence, but are made to feel less than because they don't understand English, or they don't have the right vocabulary to then engage with the knowledge that they then have. So the example of that, and for me, I went straight to my dad, for instance. Mm-hmm. So, or my parents for that matter. Like, my dad is a high chief, a Samoan high chief. He holds a couple of, actually 3 titles as a chief. As an orator, like, I could not go, like, I cannot be half the person that he is with the knowledge and the depth of the use of language that he uses in the Samoan language. However, even as simple as reading a letter from, whether that is from Centrelink, Centrelink is our social welfare, for those of you who are not familiar with the Australian system, but like even just reading a letter from one of the services, he often would call me and say, I don't fully understand. And then he finds himself really frustrated that he cannot comprehend that. But the other ones, he used to, and even in Sabbath schools, for instance, when he would sit and he has all of these thoughts, but he's not able to then articulate it in the depth of how he was thinking it in Samoan. So it's such an interesting thing. Like, I would hear him, but I haven't fully heard him. And it wasn't until I was sitting in this lecture and I'm like, oh my word, that happens right in front of my own eyes. Like, for instance, when my parents were going to New Zealand, for our family to be able to be approved for a visa to migrate, they had to pass an English language interview. And so English has become this weapon, if you wish, where those that are able to speak English really creates this gap, so that's gotten me thinking a lot about, I guess, the rest of the world. And I mean, that's just a personal example. And I think about like the Samoan language is so rich. It's so beautiful that I am ashamed that I guess I haven't really spent the time to fully dive right into it again, because that's my mother tongue. That's my first language, but it's not the language I now communicate in, and especially in my home. But just thinking about the amount of knowledge and how the intelligence, the intellect that is in the language, and the way in which it's communal, and in the way in which it's used to look after each other. And then some amazing orators that come out of our culture that I haven't actually thought about for a long time until sitting through this lecture. And I'm like, if I am processing this, how many other languages that have been killed off, that have, been dispossessed because we are privileging the English language, and I think about travels. Yeah, it's actually had me thinking about that, even in the sense of the language, like people's languages, that you are encouraged to have your first language as your second language and privilege English as your first. Even in the academias. I was just reading an article, I think it was in Switzerland, where if you were to, like, even as a Swiss native, in order for you to apply to do a doctorate, even in your native country, you actually have to apply in English. So that was really fascinating to me, because there is a move to have English as the global language, and it isn't to some extent, but that was a purposeful, organized drive as far as imperial and colonization and all of the things. So yeah, that's been fascinating.
And even just reflecting back on the Moana history book that I've referenced, one of the things that happened on the mission, with the best of intentions to try and uplift Indigenous people, was that the speaking of their traditional languages was discouraged and even punished at times.
Wow.
And so you'd have kids that were in dormitories at the school who were simply not allowed to speak their language.
Oh, wow.
That's a reality of, and in trying to put it in the best way, it was, we want you to learn to speak English so that you can function and all those things without having necessarily anything against the language, but just saying, we need you to be able to function in a broader society, and this is the world as it is now. But what is lost culturally, identity, all of those kind of things from destroying a language in that way.
For me, so again, I now speak English. It wasn't my first language. My mother tongue is Samoan. For the first, 5 years of my life, I only ever spoke Samoan. And so, but now I speak very little of it unless I'm talking to my parents. But even then, I'm speaking to my parents in English, and to my own shame. My dad often says, don't ever forget your language. Don't forget your mother tongue. I am now driven more to ensure that I maintain my first language, not my second language, but also I think about the fact that even in our education and curriculum, that one of the core subjects is English. So I just think about this in the framework of human rights and communal rights, and what a loss it is to to the world, that I guess the cultures of many of our native people is second class to that of English language. And so and again, like you and I are speaking, like for you and I to be able to do this, I'm studying in as far as academia is concerned, that was the drive to ensure that education globally privileges English. It's just fascinating learning, but also confronting for me personally too. So anyway.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because as what's the right word? As a traditional ignorant Westerner, I'm a one language person, and have dabbled in learning other languages at high school, and I'm fascinated by languages as a writer, but have never had to learn another language. Have travelled and been in places where very few people have spoken English, and been a minority English speaker in that kind of setting, but not in a way that has ever been really a disadvantage to me in any long-term or meaningful sense. And even if you have enough money in some of those situations, you can simply buy your way out of not being able to communicate.
For sure.
And so, just very brief experiences of being a minority speaker in those kind of situations, but simply largely assuming the world speaks English. And that's the privilege of being the pure chance or whatever it is of being born as someone who naturally learns the dominant language and how that makes it easier. And even, and this is something I kind of laugh at, is as someone who spends their life writing, how much easier that makes it for me to study. Because all our assessments are putting stuff together and repackaging them, representing them to our lecturers to prove that I've read and understood and all those kind of things. But the reality is there are many people that might understand it better than I do who simply struggle to express it.
Yeah, the lived experiences. And
and simply because I'm a practiced writer. And
And I
can bang out an assignment in a day relatively easily once I've done the reading. My life is easier as a student than others. Yeah. And it kind of almost feels unfair. And I've had those kind of conversations with classmates in a number of educational settings across my across the last few years in different study situations that I've been in, that because I can spin a phrase, that it is easier for me to be considered clever.
It's funny you say that, because I was just thinking that too, even just reading about it. For me, again, English is my second language, but my main spoken language. There are times I've literally had to go and I'm like, what is that word? And having to find the meaning for it, because it's not a word that I use in my everyday speaking. And the way that my brain works too, I'm like, oh, that is so rich in the Samoan language, but I don't quite know how to fully articulate that in English. It's such an interesting brain gymnastics as well. But the other thought I had was that, and you've said it, and you've just said it, that because you are able to articulate something and using the variety of words, for instance, that, you are considered intelligent, and so you kind of have these hierarchy of intelligence and intellect. But again, unless you're educated in that way, and the other thing I was thinking about too is now my brain is going all over the place because that's I'm ADHD like that. No, I'm not. I haven't officially been diagnosed. I think I've diagnosed myself. But anyway, often, again, as a kid growing up in a Samoan home, I'm often asked if I've seen certain programs or I've read this or I've read that, and I would often say I haven't, because that's not the context in which I grew up in. And therefore, if I haven't read a specific chronicle or a series of books, or I haven't read or listened to this, then somehow there is a lesser than, because it wasn't the way that I was brought up. So it's really, again, confronting, but also very interesting to kind of process that, because I've always thought it, but then to read about it, I'm like, oh my word, you're putting on paper what I've been thinking and dissecting. And also, it's just fascinating.
That's cool. I think, and it's good to help us understand those kind of things, but also I think perhaps even our experience and the experience that you and I have had, and other, many of us in the church even have had, is that we recognize the imprecision of translation, from Bible study.
Wow.
Those nerdy pastors that stand up and, the original word of, the Greek word for this is, as a real point in their sermon. We get alerted to the fact that translation is always an inexact process and requires some interpretation. And I'm sure you've had the experience, Moy, of preaching with an interpreter.
Oh, I just...
That's a fascinating experience.
Well, it's interesting because I've also had an interpreter as a Samoan, because, again, I speak mainly in English. So I've had to interpret myself sometimes when I'm in a Samoan context. But yes, Polish is the main one.
But even when you're speaking with an interpreter, and when I had an experience a few years ago where I travelled to Finland and spent a week doing a week of prayer at the church's boarding school there and youth rally and some of those kind of fun things. The most effective way to work with an interpreter is you've actually got to sit down with them beforehand and say, okay, these are my main points and these are some of the key phrases and these are, so that they can actually work out not just how to translate the literal words, but how to help translate ideas.
Yeah.
And
so rich.
This is a complicated process. And so the assumptions that come with some of the words that are used in our culture, even getting to the documents that set out, getting back to what we're talking about in our studies, the documents that set out human rights and the assumptions that come with some of the wording.
Yes.
And then how that has to, and there was I think there was a phrase, and I'm trying to think exactly what that phrase was that came up a few times in some of our readings. The idea of translating has not just to be look at the wording, but look for the cultural idea that is trying to be expressed. I think it's something like homeomorphic. So that we're not looking for just the same set of words, but we're looking for the same concept and how that concept would actually sound quite different in a different culture.
Yeah. So go on.
And that really for human rights to be meaningful across cultures, they need to be expressed in a homeomorphic way, not just in a translated way. And, I think there's a pretty good word for the day is to find the
meaning.
Yeah, and of course there's so many different cultures that we look at as well. We're talking between different languages or between different ethnic cultures perhaps, but even the church and the secular community that it is situated with. Yeah. We think we're saying one thing, but what people hear can be quite different. And so we need to find ways of being homeomorphic in the way, and I guess a good theological word would be more incarnational, to translate this thing in one place to something that actually lives and makes sense.
Contextualize it,
place or what context,
Yeah. It's interesting, like that's also triggered another thought in my mind that, for instance, like as simple as, the word sorry in English, there's not one Samoan word that could to translate it literally. We don't have just one word. To be able to express sorry in the Samoan language, you've got to use, you've actually got to articulate its meaning, and use a sentence, for instance. So, and that for me is like saying sorry in English, yes, but to say sorry in Samoan, it cuts you so deep because the person has to really express, there is an expression that comes with being able to say, I am sorry, and the way that you actually articulate that in Samoan is beautiful. And you feel their sense of sorriness. So it's one of those really interesting things that even saying love, we say it like, I love you, 3 words. In Samoan, you've got it, the way you express it, again, it's an expression, it's in meaning. And the way it's articulated, it's just envelops you. You feel love. So the richness. And I was thinking I never thought I would be taught learning this in the framework of human rights. But this is what's happened as part of this world of the violence that has been the case for a lot of cultures and a lot of Native communities and how much the world then is at a loss without that. Anyway, so that's what I've been learning of late.
I think that's very significant, and even just on a really simple and practical level, one of the most meaningful things you can do to connect with another person is to learn their language. Whether that's as direct as going and learning to speak Samoan so I can talk to your dad more meaningfully, who's I greatly respect and admire I've sat with him in church and he's praying for me or whatever.
Yes.
And you just go, why aren't we listening to you speak? Because he's the chief in the room, and he's a man of great faith and spirituality and life experience and all those things.
Yeah.
But of course, in that setting, I'm the person who's expected to speak.
Right.
But, in at times when we've been with your family and where he's the chief of the family and he speaks and prays for us all, that's something that I greatly appreciate and respect and admire. And that's, again, I just had those little moments of insight just in hanging around you and your family and your culture.
Right. Yeah. So what have you, I know, just to shift, because I've talked about what I've learnt, and that's like one lecture. What about you? Where are you up to in our studies?
Yeah, and there's been a couple of things that have caught my attention. One of them has been that we've been talking about the difference between universality in human rights and cultural relativism and the discussions there. And part of that is this idea of translation or homeomorphic expression. But one of the things that did catch my attention, and this is kind of a passing reflection, was simply that a number of the readings that we read referenced the situation in Afghanistan and the Taliban. Now, those readings were written 20 years ago,
right,
and are reflecting on the human rights abuses, and it's been sobering to be reading those at the same time as the recent resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan and the violence and the mess and the tragedy of that. And again, part of the discussions that have been going on there is, so if you were to have a discussion about human rights with someone from that very different culture, and they would say, well, human rights in our culture looks like this.
Yeah.
Who in that culture gets to decide that? And a lot of the discussions there were, well, and I think one of the readings we read was simply titled, do Muslim women need to be rescued?
Yes.
And there's some really complicated things there about respecting different cultures, but also who decides what those different cultures actually are, and what is it that we should be respecting? Should we be respecting a different culture that is actually, we can see the brutality and the the outrages that are being committed in its name. Where does that come when we're trying to respect cultural relativity and cultural specificity and, even their language and their way they would term things, at the same time as looking at something and going, no, that is wrong.
Yeah. And the lens says we actually then make that judgment and the final decision we arrive at and go, well, that is wrong. And so then the question that we ask, and I guess this is the whole idea of universality, like, do we all understand what part of that particular area is universality, And so, and which lens? Because obviously for us, we look at that and go from a Western perspective and our understanding of what we understand as human rights, we go like, that is wrong. Like, it is just wrong. And then you grow up in that culture and go, it's part of the culture, or it's part of our religious practices. It's so complex. Anyway,
and even just reflecting on that, and of course we're only then looking at one specific aspect of a horrendous, horrific situation, and and the role that Western powers have played.
Makes me weep, Nathan. I know there's much more to it, and it's been a heavy, heavy week. And I was just reading an article, and I think it was out of Adventist Peace Fellowship, which I thank you for the opportunity to share. But this idea of justice empathy and also justice fatigue, because we read all of that, and you and I obviously are right in the thick of studying all of these, and I just feel so heavy. Anyway, and keep going.
To some degree, you need to. I mean, it would be dehumanizing not to feel it.
Oh my word! But then you're like, I can't cry anymore, and then you just your heart just keeps shattering.
Yes, that idea of being resilient but tender-hearted but resilient is we don't want to be hard-hearted,
No.
And we don't want to be, waterproof in all these ways, that everything just flows over us, but we also can't be swept away by it.
No. And I think I allow myself to sometimes. It's just so hard.
And there is I'm sure there's a place for that. And a time simply, that's called prayer.
Yes, it is. I've done a lot of that. Dear God, why?
But I think that is a significant spiritual resource we have to allow us to be tender-hearted in the face of this kind of thing, is that we aren't just taking it on ourselves and that we're putting it in front of God. In the context of our faith and our understanding of who God is and what God is like, we simply put it back towards God and say, I don't understand this, I can't fix it, but I will mourn it and I will lament it and I will do what I can from my side of the world to...
Lamenting has been the only other form of expression these last few weeks. It's been so on that, and I know you've got to keep going with just a thought. So on that, just in this situation as well, especially with Afghanistan, and how do we... And okay, maybe it's a question for myself because I'm trying not to react with anger, to be honest, about our apocalyptic focus on it too, and also the very quick reactionary comments regarding, and Jesus is coming now. That might well be true, but like 20 years ago, this happened. And now it's happening again to the people of Afghanistan. Jesus doesn't come in 20 years, and that doesn't mean he's not coming. And I'm trying not to allow myself to feel anger towards the constant then rhetoric of this is a sign of Jesus coming.
Yeah, I think we sometimes paint ourselves into some perverse postures of almost applauding all the trouble in the world as a sign. And I can understand the, come Lord Jesus, that lament of how long...
Which I have prayed also, by the way. However...
that's very biblical.
It's very biblical.
But when it crosses a line into some kind of perverse glee that we were right...
Ticking the box of another sign.
And, all our motivations as humans are to be suspect. But it's when we cross a line somewhere...
Yeah.
And that's something that even at times we perhaps... we need to be careful in judging others' motivations because we know our own motivations are so mixed and messy.
Yeah.
But the first call is to respond.
Yeah.
And lament is a response, prayer is a response, but also what else can you do?
Yeah. What else?
Engaged with, some of the actions here in Australia to call for a greater intake of refugees, recognising the Afghan refugees who are already in Australia who need to be given security and certainty. So, some of the organisations that I'm engaged with certainly have been adding my voice to those things. So that's the other part of it, is there are practical responses. Our lament is not resignation.
No.
And neither is our apocalyptic. Charles Scriven in one of his writings talked about how we've kind of, and this is getting back to your question now, Adventist eschatology of resignation. To me, a much better thing is an eschatology of engagement.
I love that.
That because we believe Jesus is coming soon, we are empowered to step in and to sacrifice and to raise our voice and to take risk for goodness and particularly for serving other people.
Yeah.
I really wish, and this spills over into some other issues, that we were much more focused on serving others and standing up for others than we were for standing up for ourselves and trying to grimly defend our supposed freedoms that are being undermined. At the same time as recognising and if the situation in Afghanistan over the past little while should just put in context all our bleating about, health restrictions and wearing masks, and we aren't under threat.
We're not persecuted. It just, yes.
Yes. And that should just be, those kind of realities should be a wake-up call to say, let's recognise the comparative seriousness of our supposed infringement of our liberties for very legitimate and worthwhile reasons. Again, because we care about other people as a way of
human rights, others. Actual human rights issues. oh, Nathan, don't even get me started. I, again, other than lamenting, and then I go between lamenting and anger and then deep sadness, and then I get angry because of people like, it's my human rights. I'm like, this is not a human rights issue. Yes. Oh my word. And then I'm like, dear Jesus, forgive me for the thoughts that I am thinking right now. So it's lots of lamenting and lots of prayer for forgiveness. But yeah, so in terms of what you've learned in that space, because I kind of deviated you from there because, it's very, very present, very present. Oh.
There was one of the articles that we read that I think summed it up well, that when people are at risk, cultural relativism is less important. When people are being tortured, when people are being killed, when people, just basic life and existence is under threat, and seriously under threat, that's where the universality of human rights calls us to simply to speak and to act and to, a good biblical thing, to speak up for those who are being oppressed, and to, ensure justice for those who are being trampled on, as Proverbs 31, 8 and 9 put it, is simply, that's our response. And human rights is one of the tools in the world today that at least people understand something of the language of. We have this profound theological understanding as the underpinning of it, as the value, the image of godness, all of those things of every one of those people. Yeah. And that's why it breaks our heart. Yeah. But it's also why we act in response. And again, human rights is one of the tools that is in many ways given at least lip service in the wider world that we can insist upon. Yeah. And we have our faith foundations for that. But we just continue to insist upon the goodness of what it means to be human and the reality that this is something that needs to be better.
Yeah. It's interesting just from a faith perspective, and but one of the comments you've just made about the speaking up, but also if you are engaging with those who are living this nightmare, actually creating space to amplify their voices and their lived experiences. And probably one of the things that I guess we can say privileged to live in a world that is technologically advanced, so much so that we can do that. So for instance, in terms of those of us who are on social media and are able to share from our platforms, I have been following so many journalists and photographers who were on the ground, on Instagram, for instance, and on Twitter, and also for them to be able to share their lived experience, having been one of the people that have escaped. And, there's one in particular from National Geographic photographer that has documented his journey with everybody else that have been able to be evacuated. He's currently in London. And I guess I just have felt compelled that his story, his lived voice and experience needs to be amplified. And so whether we are able to speak up for them or not, probably our way of speaking up could well be the amplification of their own voices, whether that is on the platforms and the conversations that we have, because it is part of our engagement. Because when I'm feeling so heavy about this whole situation, I'm like, okay, how else other than signing petitions, other than, writing letters to my MP, all of that obviously is part of it. How else can we ensure that those with the lived experience voices is shared? And I think that's one of the ways, as a practical tip, for those who are wondering, there's so many.
Even that reflects on the first part of our discussion of language. And when you have an Afghani person trying to speak, it's not that they don't have a voice, it's that their voice is often not heard.
Silenced.
Even if they're speaking English, they've got a funny accent. So,
100%.
It's kind of dismissed in that way.
Yeah.
So that's the privilege we have.
Yeah.
of, as you say, amplifying their voices or using our platforms to allow them to speak. And I mean, one of the best experiences I've had of that was a couple of years ago. I was at a church camp meeting in a part of Australia. I had the opportunity to talk about issues of justice from the main stage in the main auditorium, and I invited a bunch of people to come and tell their stories, including an Iranian asylum seeker who had spent time in immigration detention facilities run by Australia. And he spoke for 10 minutes, and he spoke longer than we'd allowed him in the program, and I was just saying to the guy sitting there, let him keep talking. Because there's thousands of people here who might never have actually seen or heard one of these people telling their stories. And his story was emotional. It shared, some of the real sufferings that he and his extended family and people had been through. To me, that was the most useful thing I said for that morning, was not saying anything and sitting down and shutting up and letting this other person be heard in a place that they wouldn't normally be heard. That's one of the things that we can really aspire and try to do.
Oh, so there's a lot, and we are still catching up with our lectures, my friend.
That's it. And probably on that subject, we should stop talking and let somebody else talk. Let people go and listen to somebody else, or listen to. I know.
But again, as we have mentioned earlier, even though we're still catching up and it's like getting started again. Once you kind of get into it, at least I will speak for myself, just reading into this and being able, I'm living this right now, especially when it comes to languages. And I have a lived experience when it comes to my dad and my mom. It's so fascinating how it impacts all of us, that unbeknownst to us, we are all impacted by these issues, but it actually makes me I am more excited now to dive in again for the second semester, and also to be able to share it in reflections with everybody.
So thank you for being with us on Adventist Peace Radio with the Moy and Nathan Go to School series, ongoing series even. Thank you, Moy, for your contributions and for sharing some of the experience even of your own family and those kind of insights. That's appreciated. Thank you. And happy studying, happy assignment writing. And we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Adventist Peace Radio. If you appreciated this installment of Moy and Nathan Go to School, then I invite you to support the podcast by sharing the episode with your friends and family members. You can also support the podcast by giving us a shout out on social media or by donating to help cover the expenses of running the podcast. You can donate online at adventistpeace.org/donate. Our theme music is Green Fields by Scott Holmes, and this is available at the Free Music Archive. And our disclaimer. The Adventist Peace Fellowship is an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports work for peacemaking and social justice, building upon the values of the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. We are not part of, affiliated with, or supported by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists or any affiliates known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Any content, opinions, statements, products, or services offered by Adventist Peace Fellowship are solely those of our organization and not those of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Until next time, peace.